Hello, and welcome to the Gauntlet podcast. We look back at games that have been played by folks here on the Gauntlet. I am David, I use he, him pronouns, and I will be one of your hosts this evening, or at least as the time of my recording. I'm joined today by my co-host Shane, who uses she, her pronouns, and for whom it is definitely not evening, but Shane, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I am bitterly cold, in fact. It's basically the first day of really cold winter weather here in Melbourne. And I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm recording this from the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded.
Thank you for that. And today we are joined by Stephen, using he, him pronouns, who is a frequent GM and player on the Gauntlet, with whom I've been lucky enough to play many, many games over the years. Stephen, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing all right. I mean, I'm in California, so our seasons are, as always, they kind of slump into each other. Like, it becomes summer for a while, then it decides to be winter again, then it becomes summer again. That's basically we're in a patch kind of in the winter end of summer right now.
Excellent. Yeah, we just have to. Here in the UK, we just tend to have different seasons in single days. So that's our experience. So for the first segment, as ever, each of us is going to chat a little bit about the games that we've played in February and March, and we will talk in depth about one game in particular that we've played on the Gauntlet calendar this month. We want to go into more depth on. So we're going to start off with yourself, Shane. How's your gaming been in February and March?
Yeah, I think this was actually maybe the busiest 2-month stretch that I've had in quite a long time. Probably not really challenging LoL in terms of the number of games run, but by my standards, a pretty impressive list. So off Gauntlet, I continued my Game of the Between. On Gauntlet, I ran Hot Gay Bro Dragons, Good Society, The Girlfriend of My Girlfriend is My Friend, which Andrea talked about on the podcast last month. Finished up a quarterly game of Fate of the Fairy Queen, which was my reskin of Fate of Cthulhu. That turned out to be so good. At the end of the first month of those sessions, after 4 sessions I guess it was, I had this feeling like, this game is okay, but I deeply regret scheduling it for 12 sessions because it's just not great. I could have used that time for something else. But just like right at that point in the run, the mechanics started to click for me and for the players. Like everything came together. And from then on, every session was fantastic. So now I have the anxiety that if I'm not enjoying a game, I just need to schedule 12 sessions of it, which doesn't seem like the greatest approach, but maybe there's something to it. We had Gauntlet Community Open Gaming Weekend, so I got to play a couple of games there. Run, which Brandon ran, which was great. And Back Again from the Broken Land, which Alexi ran. That was absolutely fantastic. I ran Quietus and Miss Bernberg's Finishing School for Young Ladies, which certainly is my favourite title for a role-playing game in some time. And Macchiato Monsters is the other game I ran and the one that I want to talk about at more length. So I'm actually going to talk about Macchiato Monsters, which is the system that we ran, as well as You Got a Job on a Garbage Barge, which is the kind of setting adventure that we ran using Macchiato Monsters. So what is it? Macchiato Monsters is an OSR game by Eric Newton that comes by its name because it combines elements of previous OSR games, the Black Hack and the White Hack. I don't really know those two games well. I can't speak to whether the name Macchiato represents the proportions, where it's mostly the Black Hack with a little bit of the White Hack. I would like to see some other coffee-based role-playing games, maybe with different combinations. The reason that I wanted to run this is because I often, when I start a session on the Gauntlet, I give this introduction to what the Gauntlet is that I've basically learned from other GMs here. And I say that the Gauntlet is a community that plays a lot of role-playing games, especially story games, indie games, and OSR games. But the reality was that I had never played an OSR game. I didn't exactly know what that was. And I thought that I should, have some idea what I was talking about and that this would be a good way to do it. So OSR stands for Old School Revival or Old School Renaissance. It refers to games that are inspired more or less directly by early editions of D&D. It has some problematic elements, to say the least, in some directions, but it also has quite a cool, weird, arty side with lots of queer creators doing really interesting stuff. People like Emmy Allen and Scrap Princess, lots of others. So that's Macchiato Monsters. You Got a Job on a Garbage Barge is a kind of weird fantasy setting by Amanda Lee Frank with contributions by a whole range of OSR luminaries. Like I said, I used Macchiato Monsters to run this as a one-shot, And specifically to run, your first job is to stop the gas lake from exploding, which basically is the first of the 2 adventures that comes in the Garbage Barge. The premise is, somewhere on the barge is a lake, a whole lake that has been sealed in concrete because there is a weird, terrifying slime mold living in it. But the slime mold gives off gases, and so every few years someone has to go in and manually vent the gases so it doesn't explode. And that is the premise for the adventure. So what worked for me? Character creation in Macchiato Monsters was super fun, and I don't really think of character creation as a part of a game that is fun necessarily. You know, it's functional, it's often interesting, but it's rarely like an exciting part of play per se for me. It had really interesting ways to combine randomization and choice, both choice from lists, choice of options, as well as free choices. Part of character creation is that you get a set of dice, like a D4, D6, D8 through to a D20, and you're sort of set loose with them on this collection of random tables, where each table is a different kind of thing. Your armor, your weapons, your magic items, your inheritance, you know, how much money you have, different things like this. And you choose which dice you're going to roll on which table. So, you know, if you want the really good stuff, which is always, you know, ranked around 20 or 19 on the table, you've got to use your D20 for that. And then you've got to think about how you're going to allocate these dice to get the kinds of things that you want your character to have. And that made a kind of fun little mini game out of the establishment of the characters that I thought was really fun. Our adventuring party in the end was made up of an amateur muscleman competitor, a swashbuckling garbologist, a bumpkin, and a wretched rat cleric of the Muck Lord. Well, I say in the end, but actually half those characters died during our first random encounter in the true OSR style, so not really the final group. But it was a great, you know, really fun collection of characters that worked in that sort of gonzo setting. And the real star in the session was the Garbage Barge. I wanted to just read the first paragraph of the text to give you a sense of the flavour here. The Garbage Barge has been slogging up and down the coast for years, putting into port and accepting unwanted things in exchange for gas to keep the tugboats running. It is a towering, leaking wreck, and it's your home. You are a wizard, or a pirate radio operator, or a raccoon, or a barge worker, or maybe you raise goats in the listing high-rise that's been dumped on the stern. Things grow in the trash. Chemicals are leaching out of rusted barrels, growing legs, and heading out to seek their fortunes. Beetles tell you their life stories. It goes on like this. I guess it gives you a sense of the vibe. So this is the setting. You got a job on a Garbage Barge, absolutely worth getting just for the map alone. One of my favourite maps that I've seen in any gaming product. The art is so great. The concept itself is fantastic. Aaron King, who does the Read the Fucking Manual podcast, contributed a D100 smell table, which is an amazing piece of work, including subtables for things like beer smells, soap smells, rotting flesh, what does the sentient smell want, just absolutely perfect. And the kind of consistent use of random tables, which I understand to be a sort of feature of OSR-style play, really did produce some interesting and unexpected results at the table that I couldn't have, you know, prepped or planned for, or I don't think would have emerged organically any other way. For example, one of the random encounters we rolled was with a cranky group of raccoons called the Boffs, and one of the characters was named Buff, and of course there was some, like, wacky, almost Abbott and Costello-style confusion as they mistook each other for members of the same family. So some things that I'm less sure about, and I am conscious here that, like I say, I'm an OSR noob and all this may be screamingly obvious or just besides the point to people who are more familiar with the style. It was really striking to me that the rules stopped contributing much of interest once we moved on from character creation and got into play. I've gotten used to a more story game style approach where the rules and the mechanics actively contribute interesting material and changes to the fiction. And I find myself a bit adrift in a game where the rules are really just telling me, yes, you succeed or no, you don't. Yes, you rolled under that stat, no, you didn't. I found the same thing the other day. I ran a Delta Green one-shot and I had the same feeling at the end of, like, we barely touched the dice. Were we really playing the game? I accept that that's a difference in play style. It's not a critique per se. It's just interesting to me. And this isn't even necessarily a what I'm less sure about, but I think I have to mention the editing on the Garbage Barge, or the lack of editing on the Garbage Barge. It is a bit of a mess in pretty basic ways. The page references on the random encounter table are all wrong, so trying to look something up quickly when you roll it during play, pretty impossible. Some of the key locations in the adventure are just missing, including the one that presumably forms the climax of the adventure, the part where you get in and are supposed to vent the gas. no idea what is actually supposed to happen in the adventure there. And of course, it's okay to improvise that stuff, but it would have been nice to know what the designer intended. It's definitely part of its charm, and the idea that you have this like ramshackle, chaotic trash setting in this chaotic, almost unusable zine format really does, there's a form and content thing there that's really nice. But it's much better, working much better as a source of inspiration than it is as a reference for the table. So my takeaways for this, I'm glad I tried it. I'm interested to play more OSR games. I do find it baffling as a story gamer that there are so many rule sets that basically try to do the same thing as each other. All the OSR rule sets seem designed to produce the same experience at the table in minusculely different ways, which I just find a bit confusing. I don't really understand. Saying that Macchiato Monsters seems as good as any of them, like it sounds like I'm having a go at it, but I think really that's the intention. They are all supposed to be pretty much as good as each other. But I had a good time with it, and I would run it again. The Barge is an amazing setting. I don't think it necessarily shone as brightly as it could in the one-shot that we ran. I think you'd really want more time to explore and meet the factions and find all kinds of weird trouble that you could get into. And I think, again, I really feel like I've drunk the story game Kool-Aid on this stuff, but I really think it would benefit from some mechanics for stuff like social interactions and intrigue to really make it shine. But I'm definitely excited about it and excited to check out some more of Amanda's work. And that is my wrap-up on Macchiato Monsters and the Garbage Barge.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Shane. Yeah, I will also confess to being a bit of a novice when it comes to OSR stuff, but You Got a Job on the Garbage Barge is one of those projects that I have backed on Kickstarter just because it was such a great concept and I loved everything about it. Not got around to reading it yet, probably will someday, but yeah, no, that's really glad that you had a good experience with it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Even if you don't read it, I really recommend checking out the map. It looks fantastic.
Nice. Thank you very much for that. So next, Stephen, would you like to tell us a little bit about the games you've been playing? Well, I was going to say this month, but in February and March.
Yeah, this past couple months, off the Gauntlet, I have been running Hearts of Wulin for my personal gaming group. We have been doing pirates using the setting Straverasa from the Thousand Islands setting books, which has been fun. As I said in the Slack, there was a whole... Basically, we treated it as a duel. Two of the player characters were trying to impress the captain with the skill of their ability to swab the decks, and we treated that with the duel mechanics. So one of them surrendered being the worst swabby to the other for some XP, which was very fun. But yeah, on the Gauntlet, I have been doing the reading club for a while now. Just at the end of February, we were wrapping up a run of The Veil using Lowell's Veiled Fantasy hack, and that had its plus and minuses. I definitely think that a lot of Lowell's additions add a lot to The Veil and kind of streamline a few things. I also think that, like, there are definitely a few bits that, like, if I were to kind of iterate upon what Lowell did, I think there are a few ways that some of the rules can be adjusted to kind of fit that fantasy a little bit better. But I think Lowell does a lot of really cool stuff in adapting it. I'm also GMing a run now of Monsterhearts, inspired by Shannon McGuire's Every Heart a Doorway, which David is actually a part of, and that's been really fun. I'm going to be talking more about that. And then I also have been getting a chance to play some of these hot new Forged in the Dark games. Raise the Twilight Throne. I realize after the fact I'm playing Bayonetta, but with butterflies instead of hair. And I'm also in Jesse's run of Brinkwood, which has been fun. Yeah, both are really fun Forged in the Dark games. Incredibly complicated. So know that going in, but they are very fun. So the game that I have been running from March through April is a run of Monsterhearts, inspired by Shannon McGuire's Every Heart a Doorway, which is part of her Wayward Children series. Now, Monsterhearts is something that probably everyone on the Gauntlet knows. There's a pretty good chance you've heard of it even if you're not part of the Gauntlet. It's the game about being queer teen monsters falling in love and lust with each other as they deal with the horrors of being monsters, but also being teens. But as part of the Gauntlet Reading Club, we've kind of changed that up a little bit. You know, Shan McGuire's Wayward Children series is a world in which basically there is this large multiverse of worlds. Children frequently end up going on portal fantasies from our world to these other places, but eventually their adventure ends and they return. And how do they deal with both the trauma of stuff they encountered there and also the trauma of leaving behind or getting abandoned by all these formative things that are part of them now and just being kind of shuttled back to our world. And so, rather than playing like teen monsters, we are focusing on a bunch of teens who have returned from various portal fantasies and have been changed and become a bit monstrous in their time there. So, I mean, in terms of what worked for me, now, there's a lot in Monsterhearts that works for me. You know, Shane brought up OSR. This is kind of, I'd say, as close to, like, a blueprint for PBTA as you can get.
Definitely.
There are just so many of the mechanical things that we think of as being part of PBTA today that, like, just get their start in Monsterhearts. You know, you have the strings, which appears in various forms, and I think is really one of the kind of coolest bits of Monsterhearts that Avery Alder originated, where you have basically a currency on the other player characters, on NPCs, and as you gain these on them, you can eventually use them, and I think the most interesting way is that you can spend them to tempt them. And this is basically used in lieu of a kind of diplomacy role, where you basically say, I'm spending this, and if you agree to do what I want, then you get an XP. I think that's really one of the best bits of Monsterhearts, and then of course there's all the other kind of, just that the moves themselves often push these very kind of complicated social dynamics. You know, you have to turn someone on, which is probably the coolest bit, and as well as shut someone down. It's a game that is really about pushing social dynamics, and a bit, again, like Shane kind of brought up, it's one of those games where, you know, after you play it, you're like, why doesn't every game let me shut someone down? But in terms of, like, this particular adaptation, it ended up being a game that I just found really easy to wed the mechanics in the game with the setting. Like, the premise ended up offering a really good foundation for us to build off of. It hits that kind of middle point where it was specific enough that we kind of had a shared point of reference, but the fact that you were dealing basically with a multiverse that we were just never really visiting meant that there were a lot of these sweeping empty spots in which to kind of paint the multiverse and be pursued by murderous Cheshire cats. I was also really curious about how easy it would be to kind of imagine these other worlds kind of going in for both PCs and, like, the other NPC students. But it ended up, like, the players at the table, David, Kay, Sabine, and Marley, they all really brought a ton of cool ideas for these other worlds. And the kind of interesting thing about that is that it gave me a lot of leeway to just really, like, roleplay weird NPCs that would definitely, I think, play a little bit false if we were doing a little bit more of a typical small town setting. But, like, of course the girl from the pirate world doesn't care if you murdered somebody. She just cares about how you dispose of the body and things like that. So yeah, there was a lot of cool space there for us to be kind of very weird while at the same time being kind of very emotionally real. Because, yeah, that was the other thing, that, like, the fact that all these characters had that shared fact that they left behind these worlds that they couldn't go back to kind of ended up giving this strong, like, through line for all the characters that really kind of gave us a good thematic cohesion. Like, everybody was sort of driven by this longing for these worlds that they left behind, And that was something that kind of all of the characters sort of came back to at some point. And so it created this nice through line there that I found really cool. Sabine in particular really lent into that with their version of the Ghost, where they reworked the Ghost moves to sort of be about the trauma of abandonment rather than the trauma of death, which I thought was really cool. What I'm less sure about is that it's a game that really shows its age. It is definitely one of those older PBTA games, and one of the big things that a lot of them seem to have in common is that a lot of their XP systems can be very wonky. Like in Monsterhearts, there's really this sort of drip feed of XP, because if you're just rolling well, you're practically never getting XP except when people get really happy on spending those strings. And then on the other hand, you have some playbooks like the Hollow that are just kind of these absurd, like, XP generating machines. Like, there's a way that the XP feels very imbalanced in Monsterhearts, and it can lead to some sort of weird pacing issues. Like, we are at this point where the school is about to be burnt down by one of the player characters, there's a monster hunting kids, and everybody still only earned about 1 advancement each. So there's definitely some room there, I think, for kind of reworking that XP system more than is already there. I also think that there's some, I think some of the way it has a tendency of talking about, language in terms of, how it handles some of its themes of sexuality. I understand where it's coming from, where it wants to push these elements, because they're not often featured in a lot of role-playing games. But at the same time, I feel like whenever I'm running or playing in a run of Monsterhearts where there's a new player, you end up needing to do this sort of repair of what people's perceptions of Monsterhearts is. And that it's not the game about, teen monsters fucking. There's a lot more to it than there. And I think some of the move names, like Turn Someone On, definitely have a tendency to create that misperception rather than highlight what the game is actually like, which is about being these vulnerable teen monsters. And so I get why it does that. I also feel like it doesn't always serve the game as well as it could, I feel. So overall, I love Monsterhearts. There are definitely some old bits where it shows its age, but it's the go-to game, really, for running super dramatic soap opera PBTA.
Well, thank you very much for that, Stephen. And yeah, I can just confirm that this run has been an absolute joy to play, and I've had a lot of fun with it.
Yes, David and Kay proving the opposite of my point, that it is more than a game about teen monsters fucking. Because really, that is all the two of you have been doing with each other this run.
It's very fair. I was going to bring that point up, but yes. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the games I have been playing. As sort of a continuation from my last stint on the podcast, I have had a fairly quiet February and March. I've not been in that many games, though the ones I have been in have all been very good. So I was in a game of Legacy that I mentioned last time, as well as the Gauntlet Reading Club run of Monsterhearts 2, as just mentioned. The game, though, I'm going to discuss there, I'm going to be a bit cheeky and sneak in a game that I played at the very beginning of April, because it's a game I've been looking forward to for a long time, finally got around to playing. So the game I played, and will now be talking about, is called Red Carnations on a Black Grave. So this is a historical game by Kat Rahman, set in the Paris Commune of 1871, in which you play a cross-section of sort of revolutionary figures trying to hold out against the French army. As I said, this is obviously based on real events. There was a popular uprising against the French government in Paris, and that's sort of where you come into this from. The title comes from a poem, or an excerpt from a poem. I'm not 100% sure which, but I will read now. It says, "Brother, if I should go at last into a cold and black tomb, let fall on my graves like hopes past, some red carnations all in bloom." This was by Louise Michel, who was one of the figures influential in the Paris Commune, and is in fact one of the characters that you can play in the game, and was played in our run by Donna, who is also facilitating this. So the game is inspired by Montsegur 1244 by Frederick Jensen. This, I think, without going back and looking through receipts, I think this was one of the very first like true story games I picked up, and I've always been really excited to play it. Still haven't, as these things tend to go. But this Montsegur was about the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade holding out against the crusading army. So it's a sort of very similar idea of the setting and the sort of mechanics as well. It all sort of play into one another. So yeah, as I said, it has a historical setting, and many of the characters in it are historical figures, interspersed with some fictional characters as well to kind of pad things out. Sounds like a negative. That's not what it is. It's to sort of introduce some other perspectives of people that weren't necessarily recorded in history. So some of the more kind of, normal people, man on the street type figures, as well as some figures from France's foreign holdings and the like who are also present. So yeah, it's, I think, probably the best way of calling it is a structured freeform game. I'm bad at terminology, but I think that's broadly right. So it's a game that's split into 3 acts. So essentially you have the sort of the early days of the Commune and sort of their initial victories, the period where there's both an intensification of the French assault on the city, as well as consolidation of power within the city itself in the Commune. And finally, the 3rd act is the collapse of the Commune, which was a very violent event in history and in the game as well. So the way the game is played is essentially it's all based on cards. But these aren't cards. There's no real sort of randomized resolution system or anything like that. The cards that you get are really points of inspiration. Your characters all come on little cards, and there are cards that sort of depict certain events in the game. And actually, the only aspect that is semi-randomized, or well, is randomized, comes at the end of the game, which also uses cards. So the way it works, you sort of basically every person controls 2 characters. Those characters, as I said, are written on cards. So the way we did it anyway, there are some kind of preset play sets that you can play with, sort of laid out in the game book itself. But the way we did it was essentially we drew 3 cards off the top of the deck. One person chose one of them. We refreshed it. The next person chose one, so on and so forth, until we all had our 2 characters sorted out. A similar thing is then done in each act. Everyone narrates one scene. Everyone frames one scene. And likewise, there are a series of events to base those scenes around that you draw from a deck. There's one deck that covers the first 2 acts, and the second deck that covers the 3rd act. Once you're in a scene, though, everything is purely narratively driven. There is only one rule, and that is that in the first act, nobody can die. In the second act, one person's character can die. By the end of Act 3, everyone has to have had one of their characters die.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, because it is definitely one of the things I liked. But it's and that is purely like volition. That is the character chooses when their character dies. There is no dice rolling. There's no point. The only stipulation is that they have to be dead by the end of that act. So that is sort of the key rule, is about who can live and die. Then finally you get to the epilogue thing, where all of your characters who survived up until that point get to choose whether they try and flee the city, whether they keep fighting sort of to the bitter end, or whether they throw themselves, get arrested and put on trial. I may have confused that slightly, but there's certainly 3 different options that you can choose. And depending on which option you choose, you get to draw from a deck of cards. And each of those cards that you draw will say what actually happens to you. And there's sort of a bit of a play in there where different characters are members of different factions, and some of the cards have different effects depending on which faction you were a member of. So, for instance, if you're actually a member of the National Guard, the sort of the Revolutionary Army, you have a much higher chance of getting executed no matter what you do, because they were tended to be slated for execution. So, which is to basically say that once you get to the end of it, your surviving characters still have a very high chance of ending up dead, or at least imprisoned or otherwise in a bad spot, because things did not go well for the people of the Paris Commune. So what I liked about this game, I think I've covered sort of a little bit of it already, probably just from what I've said. It's a really interesting period of history to play in. It's not a period of history I myself am much of an expert in. I've studied the French Revolution prior to that, but not so much the Paris Commune, the sort of mid to later 19th century revolutions. The characters are all really evocative, both the ones that are real and the ones that aren't. And I had to sort of go back just before we've had this podcast. I actually had to go and check which one of the characters I played were actually real people and which ones weren't, because I couldn't tell from the description. Some were a bit more obvious. So, like I said, Louise Michel was kind of one of the figureheads of the commune. One of the characters that was played is a famous artist. So those ones are quite easy to spot. But some of the other smaller characters, it's more difficult to tell who's real, as it were. The material does a really good job of giving you hooks to play, both in the characters themselves and the questions that you ask one another, as well as the events that come up in play, which gets over a lot of the problems that you can have with the sort of like, oh, I don't know what to do with this scene, that you can get in a lot of freeform games where you're just like, I don't really know what to do here. You always have that sort of choice. Those options up in front of you that really give a strong idea of where to go. As mentioned, the character death is really, really strong as a player. It gives you a lot of power to obviously choose your own fate as a player, which is always good. But it also creates genuine tension in the game that often isn't so present in more freeform games. The fact that there's one scene, for example, where there was a mother and daughter involved in a gunfight with the French army in a cemetery, sheltering behind a big monument. And it was in the third act. Both of the players hadn't had one of their characters die yet. So as a player who was not involved in that scene, I was just watching there going, are they going to die? I don't know. I can't tell. There is no way for me to tell if at some point one of them is just going to get shot. And it really does add a level of tension in there that I thought was excellent. So yeah, that's really great. The other thing as well is some of these the events give some really interesting topics of discussion to come up. We definitely had one of the scenes we had was about toppling a victory column of Napoleon, and sort of the reactions to that, which was obviously very on point for the last couple of years, and the diversity of the characters and stuff as well. It all leads to some really interesting interactions and conversations. What I'm less sure about, it's not so much that I'm less sure about it, but the initial choice of characters can really change how the game feels, which is in many ways a good thing. But it does mean, so we ended up with, just through the choices we made, we ended up with a group of people that much more represented the kind of the intelligentsia side of the commune rather than the people on the street. So we ended up with a lot of scenes that were sort of like a lot of talking and discussion rather than going out there and manning the barricades sort of thing. Though we did get some of that as well. I also made a choice. They were both really excellent characters, but they were also characters that were quite similar. So I picked one character who was a Russian journalist who was a member of the First International, and I also played a Caribbean doctor who was also a member of the First International. So both being characters who were sort of from outside of Paris, were members of the First International. I ran into a bit of, trying to differentiate them from one another was a little difficult at times. The other thing I think as well that's always a consideration with these sort of games is some players find historical games really hard. And there's always going to be a bit of reservation there to playing a game that where you feel like you aren't doing it right or don't know enough or anything else. I think that this game does an excellent job of preparing you for that. It really does have a very strong support for the history in it. And actually, if you read the book itself, it's got like 50 pages on French history, essentially. So the information is there and the support is really there on the cards and stuff. But it's still going to be a consideration for some players, I think, as to how much they can buy into a historical game. So yeah, my takeaway is it's a great game, as I think I've made quite obvious my opinions on that. Like I said, you have to know what you're getting in for. It won't be for everyone. It is ultimately a real-life tragedy. It is set in a detailed and complex historical and political situation, but the game does a good job of supporting you through all of that. So yeah, I would absolutely encourage playing it, and I'm also hoping to finally get around to playing Montsegur 1244 as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, have you taken a look at Stonewall 1969 yet?
Oh, wow.
I haven't, no.
It was kickstarted a little while back. Hasn't been officially released yet, but I know there's playtest packets around. It's another hack of Montsegur set in the Stonewall Rebellion.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'd love to have to get a look at that. No, I had that one had passed under my radar.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks.
So, in our second segment, Stephen is going to talk about a topic of his choice. So, Stephen, what did you want to talk about today?
Yeah, well, fortunately, it was a little bit. David had specifically asked me to come if I wanted to talk about the Gauntlet Reading Club. So I had some idea of what. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Basically, the Reading Club was actually originally created by David just at the January of last year, I believe, is when you posted your Wolf Song run, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And it was something that I had actually been kicking around in the back of my head as well for a while, because there were just some books that I thought these might make interesting settings for a role-playing run. But I hadn't really figured out how to write pitches for it's like this book, but but I'll be helping you figure that out. So David just deciding to straight up facilitating a reading club before doing the run was just frankly way easier than anything I thought of doing. So yeah, following after David's run, I had scheduled the first of my runs that I was facilitating of the reading club. I got the name wrong, which is how it ended up being the reading club rather than the book club. And yeah, we're just wrapping up the 5th club, including David's original run, at the end of this month. And we're going to be continuing on doing Invisible Kingdom by G. Willow Wilson with Alas for the Awful Sea. So I'm wondering, is there any particular elements of this that you're interested in me focusing on, David or Shane?
Yeah, so I mean, what I understand is that the format for these is that there's a dedicated session for the reading group part per se,
Yeah.
and then that informs the game that you play over the sessions that follow. So I guess I'm interested, what's the content of the reading group session itself? Is it like a more typical reading group where you're talking about, themes and characters and elements, or is it more focused on the elements that you want to work into the game? What actually happens in the reading group part?
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Basically, the reading group, the way I've been structuring it, and this is something that kind of has been growing out of iterating upon the various times I've done it. We generally have been spending about usually the first half of the group kind of doing the more traditional reading club, talking about the book, what we liked about it, it's the themes like you brought up. And I found that kind of gives us a chance to just sort of consider, to get us all thinking about the book before we really start diving into, but how are we actually going to put this into play? After that, we also, I've liked to kind of get a brief ideas from folks of alternate ideas for other things we might have used for the book to kind of emulate it in an RPG, and it's produced some interesting ideas that definitely I wouldn't necessarily have come upon. We brought up the idea of doing Every Heart a Doorway with masks, which I think is definitely something that it would be interesting to return to it and do a more, after this run, and do a more adventure story where we were actually traveling between worlds, and to sort of maybe even return with some of the same characters, but reworking them as masks PCs, I think would definitely be interesting or neat. And then finally, we kind of spent some time talking about kind of the specifics, like usually the way I've been doing this is because the way that posting on the Gauntlet works is that I've generally been introducing the game that I'm going to be running, and we spend some time specifically talking about the game that I've introduced to pair them together with, and how we sort of, what elements in particular we want to draw from the book, and which elements we think won't necessarily work as well in the game, or what we might want to downplay. This was something that kind of came up in the first club that David ran, where a lot of the people weren't feeling the sort of way that in Wolfsong, these white werewolves often talk about, yes, this is our land that we are, bound to by blood. And it's like you're a bunch of white people in the United States. It's let's be honest there. But yeah, so and I think that's produced some definitely coming out of it. One of the things that I've really enjoyed is the way that players will bring things to the setting that weren't necessarily there in the original, but that kind of introduce this new kind of weft that you weave into this setting that we're using as the baseline to kind of improv off of. This was something that really came up in the first one I was running, which was Cosmonites by Hannah Templar paired with Thirsty Sword Lesbians, when Puckett decided, well, I'm going to play an AI. And that's something that definitely does not show up in Cosmonites, but it ended up introducing this well, okay, how do we play around with this AI within this kind of world of neo-feudal space jousting. And I thought that was really, that this was a really, there ended up being a whole subplot of power suits gaining sentience and all that really kind of took a lot of the themes that we were playing around with and kind of added in this layer of transhumanism. I mean, I remember, David, you were in that run. Was there anything that kind of because you had read the book as well, was there anything that kind of surprised you in that run?
Yeah, I think quite a few bits and pieces that sort of felt novel, but on brand, on theme, however you want to phrase it. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I had in my mind when I came to running it for the first time, and have definitely experienced since, which is this idea that as always ends up getting said, there's no point trying to just play the book. Mm-hmm. The book's already there, it's done. But the setting provides a good kind of kicking off point, and I think the most difficult thing to articulate when doing an introduction to a game is tone. Tone is really hard to kind of convey in a way outside of it. And I think that's one of the strengths of this, is that you do get this, everyone has a kind of shared understanding of at least how the world should feel. And then that means that you can introduce characters, introduce concepts that really, do challenge the setting and alter the setting, but still feel true to the setting. So we had the conflicted experiences of our two runaway princesses, essentially, who had very different kind of reactions to and responses to, I suppose, is a better way of putting it, their situations, which again were because you don't want to be too much we're just doing the same thing as in the comics. And I think that kind of impetus to change things a bit is a really good sort of creative drive.
Yeah. And I think that's also was true of your character as well. I wasn't really thinking of it, but you kind of wanted to push that question of exploring what masculinity looks like in this world, because that was something that was sort of, it was at the periphery of Cosmonites, which is, I should note, mostly about lesbian disasters fighting in mechs, is kind of, if we want to sum up why you want to read Cosmonites, there you go. But you want to kind of push that, kind of some of the questions surrounding the way masculinity is portrayed in that world, which comes up in Elements, and then I think you quickly fell into becoming the teen dad.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Avoided the disaster twink that time around.
No, I know, you've only, like, 3 of my runs you've been in, and you've only played 1 disaster twink so far. And even then, you're out, like, Hayes in that group, so you're basically, like, still taking second, like, rank in terms of disaster twinks.
I like to think of the disaster twink that you would have played in the Paris Commune.
Yeah. So it probably would have been a little off trend, but that said, I'm sure it could work out.
One thing I was curious about is like how you sort of pair these things up. Do you generally start with like a game and then think about a book that would work with it, or vice versa? Like, do you have tips on what sort of books work well in this context?
Oh, I'll just say full-on dork when it comes to books. I have spreadsheets in which I have marked down the books I've read for the year, along with the days that I read them on and the year that they were published. And I have been putting together just a spreadsheet of like games that I'm familiar enough with that I could run. And then I've just been like brainstorming and making notes in it as time goes on. In terms of, like, books that are easy, I mean, of course, there's the fact that genre books generally tend to be easier than, like, historical fiction or contemporary fiction, just because of the wealth of RPGs that do exactly those areas. But I think that at least the games that I come with a certain familiarity with, the games that I've tended to the books I've tended to gravitate towards are ones that generally feature, like, to a certain amount, like, I guess what's the word here? I mean, I want to say gay disasters is to a certain degree, true of a lot of the books I have put out on the reading club so far. But also that I kind of like to approach these games from the perspective of what are the core things that need to be true to kind of play the game, and then sort of thinking about what books kind of support those core truths. And so, like, Alas for the Awful Sea is technically about being 19th century sailors, but the way the most of the mechanics work are that really you just need to be a crew of some sort, and you can kind of, fill in the fiction around that.
Yeah, for me, when I did Wolf Song, that was very much an incredibly obvious choice. It was a book I had read. I'd also been wanting to do some more bite marks. They are both very heavily in that kind of werewolf romance world, so that was a very, very obvious choice. Kind of going back to what was said earlier, I really like the idea of being able to kind of pick a game in that initial book club thing, but just with both the way that organising games in the Gauntlet tends to work, and also just like mental load. It's a bit more difficult to do that when it's much easier to come into that session saying, okay, we are going to be playing this game, so we'll need roughly this many sessions, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's also a much easier pitch.
Yeah.
Because if people if people know the game you're going to run, they'll know whether or not they actually want to be a part of that run continuing forward.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
But actually, on the subject of picking books, I've been having a certain eye towards diversity, and one of the issues I've been having is, like, surrounding kind of cultural appropriation within gaming, and, like, what sort of settings should we or shouldn't we feel comfortable depicting at the gaming table. And, like, picking books written by POC authors necessarily means you're going to mean not exclusively, but the settings you'll tend to find are ones that focus on POC communities. And so the anxiety I run into, then, is that I'm just mining other people's histories and cultures as a sort of gaming material at the table, without respecting those actually living people.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. It's a difficult line to draw, I guess, and I tend to agree that there are some books out there that I would really, really like to explore in this sort of way, but I'm not sure that I would feel like I had the knowledge and the background to do it. I mean, one we've discussed, I know previously, is Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. It's an amazing book, but it has the dual issue that it is very, very heavily based in African folklore, which is just something I do not have a very good grasp on at all. And also the book itself has some very, from the other side of things as well, the book itself has some very hard-hitting content in it, to say the least.
All the trigger warnings we should just know
That
now.
is-
Like just just go through the list of trigger
Exactly, yeah.
warnings and apply all of them to the book.
Yeah, exactly. It's, and I mean, it's great, like that, you know, and that's not a mark against it, but it is not a light read. It's not an easy read, and it's something that is difficult to recommend for kind of reading for fun in some ways, even though, like I said, it is an excellent book. So yeah, I think you're right. It's a difficult one to pull in, especially as well when so many of the games that you might potentially be using have their own issues around, you know, appropriation and stuff in the first place. So yeah, I think it's a very valid concern.
Yeah, and I think to clarify, I think that like the answer can't just be like you shouldn't use these settings, because
No, absolutely.
the issue becomes then that, like, you know, Jason Cordova's house culture game that he did, and similarly Dog Eat Dog by Liam Lewinick Burke, like, they're games that like necessarily involve engaging with these cultures where many of the people playing are likely going to be outsiders.
Yeah, and I think actually that's quite an interesting one, because I think Dog Eat Dog does it quite a good, well, in a way that is perhaps more, I'm not going to say approachable necessarily, but I think it plays with a level of abstraction that, you know, it is expressly, you know, that there is no kind of canonical culture in the game itself, and even though it's very clearly based on very real experiences, it uses the structure of play to tell that story rather than the trappings of play, I suppose, would be a way of putting it. But I'd agree that it is more difficult when the overall cultural context, I think, is when it's more kind of involved, and especially when it's about living cultures as well.
Yeah, and I think the point I was trying to I trailed off on was that not playing certain games, also like with what I was bringing up, kind of in the end, like, I feel like the ramification of that is that it's going to lead to, like, excluding certain minority designers from like, being able to produce things from their own experience or from their own, like, research.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's something you've definitely seen a lot of course, people say, well, actually, no, we want our games to be played.
Right.
We just want them to be played, you know, respectfully and yeah. Well, listeners, it's now time for our third and final segment of this podcast. So, all that remains for me to say is, what is giving you life? We'll start off with yourself, Shane. What has been giving you life this last little while?
So I do feel like this is probably screamingly obvious, but what's giving me life this month has been Our Flagman's Death, the gay pirate romance television series, currently available, I'm sure, on a streaming service wherever you happen to live. I don't necessarily think this is a good show, but it is really fun, really lovable, and yeah, has just been a joy to watch and to think about all of the many role-playing games that I would love to run a gay pirate romance story in. It turns out there are very many.
And yeah, Stephen, what has been giving you life?
Oh man, I mean, recently, because I don't just want to talk more about books, given that I've talked all about them, I've been playing Tunic. It is totally a Zelda knockoff, as the title implies. You play a little fox in a green tunic who has a sword and a shield, is collecting things, and there is an entire in-game manual that is inspired by an SNES manual, like instruction booklet, that reveals, like, secret things about the world and what you can do that you actually could do the entire game. You just weren't told that pressing the button in that way did that, which I thought was a cute bit.
Awesome. That sounds great. I will have to check that out. And finally, for me, I would also say that Our Flagman's Death has been giving me a considerable amount of life as well. As I said in the Slack, I feel like half of the characters in that were 100% characters that I would make for an RPG, including at least a couple of disaster twinks. So that's all well and good. However, the other thing that has been giving me life in my continuing bid to take this segment all too literally is I have just started. It's still in the second week of starting to pick up running again, which has been fun, and that is genuinely true. It is obviously knackering, but I've sort of felt a little inactive for some time now, and just getting out there and getting the heart racing and stuff has actually been really, really genuinely good. So I've been gaining much life from that. Hopefully, we'll see. So yeah, and that is our show. So thank you very much to everyone who has played with us over the last couple of months. Thanks to all of our listeners. And you can check out show notes for more information about the games that we've discussed. You can find out more about the Gauntlet at www.gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can find articles, you can find out the information about this and all of our other podcasts, you can find links to our forums, you can follow us as well on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And if you're interested in playing games with the Gauntlet, do check out the forums, check out the calendar. There are games available, all games that are available there can be freely signed up to, if there are spaces available, which admittedly there aren't always. However, if you are interested, you can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet, where you can sign up and get early access to games. You can get our monthly gaming magazine, Codex, all sorts of other cool stuff. So do, as I said, mostly check out the forum, check out the website, check out Patreon if you wish. And remember, finding all of these, the hard part is spelling Gauntlet right. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.